In order to become Viksit Bharat, one would have expected by now a roadmap, and we still don't have a roadmap from this government. Independent economists, including myself, estimate that the country needs, on average, for the next 2.5 decades until 2047, at least on average 8% per annum growth. We are nowhere close to it. What the finance minister does not state, and most government spokespersons don't recognize, is that we have, for the last 20 years, already been the second fastest growing large economy in the world. I believe that the central government has actually overplayed its card by giving them more than was necessary. That they would have gotten more, we knew, given that, the demand was made by Mr. Naidu for 1 lakh crores. This government over the last 10 years has failed to recognize the loss in jobs, the high rates of open unemployment that have happened under its watch. It doesn't even recognize or acknowledge the problem. That's why there is a constant stream of misinformation and disinformation being put out by government economists. And yet, in 10 years, I've not heard the word employment from very much in the budget. No one wants to be in agriculture. They have been forced to be in agriculture. And thanks to this government's policy shock delivered by its own policies, that there's been an increase in the number of workers in agriculture. The term empowerment is rather difficult to define. I don't know how the Prime Minister defines it, and honestly, in the context of a budget, I don't know how to define it myself. I think the government got away without doing too much for the middle class.
Hello and welcome to HW News English. I am Shubham Chohan. It's been 5 days since Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman tabled the 2024 Union Budget. This was her 7th consecutive budget as Finance Minister and the first of the newly elected NDA government. In her speech, the Finance Minister spoke on multiple issues, including inflation, unemployment, budgetary allocations, and the government's overall spending plan for the upcoming year. The Opposition India Alliance says this was a Kursi Bachao budget, notably to NDA allies, critical NDA allies, which is first Andhra Pradesh Chief Minister Chandrababu Naidu and the other Bihar Chief Minister Nitish Kumar and their states featured rather prominently in this budget. The government's internship scheme, reduced custom duty, new tax slabs were among the highlight points. But what did the middle class get, and how severe is the unemployment crisis in India? We spoke to Professor Santosh Mehrotra, an economist and visiting professor, Centre for Development Studies at the University of Bath in the UK. He spoke at length on the budget and the issues we talked about earlier. So do watch this insightful conversation till the end. Let's begin. Professor Mehrotra, thank you so much for taking out the time and speaking with me. I know it's been a pretty hectic schedule for you, so I'll get straight into the questions. Earlier this week, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented the Union Budget, her 7th consecutive budget as Finance Minister. In her speech, Professor Mehrotra, she says, we need to focus on 4 major castes, namely Garib, which is poor, Mahila and women, Yuva, youth, and Annadata. Your opening comments, Professor Mehrotra, on the Union Budget.
I'll give you comments on the union budget in a minute, but these 4 are not caste groups. I mean, this is just a completely misleading use of terminology and ideas by the Prime Minister, which is not surprising for the Prime Minister. However, now let me turn to the budget itself. The first point that strikes you about the budget for this government is the following: that the government is on a has been on a fiscal consolidation path for an extended period, which has also meant that public expenditure to GDP has in fact consistently been shrinking, which clearly leaves rather little leeway for the government, fiscal leeway, a subject we will come back to later. Having said that, I think it's let me go further to say that by spending second point, by spending uh, increasingly larger amounts on infrastructure, on capex for infrastructure, the government is leaving itself less fiscal space for doing much else. And this economy needs a lot else than investment in infrastructure. No one's saying we don't need investment in infrastructure. But let me say a few things about the investment in infrastructure, which the media has just been making a lot out of. The first thing about it is this, that the central government itself may have increased public expenditure. However, it is at the expense of investments uh, carried out by the public sector undertaking. So net, you are not seeing any greater public investment on infrastructure by the government as a whole, central government as a whole, compared to earlier times for this government itself. So it's a net. It's pretty much the same. The second thing that I think needs to be pointed out is the following: that for this government since 2014, in the last 10 years, uh, investment to GDP ratio has never exceeded 31%, and that's what it is in this budget as well, just under. And now that is very unfortunate for the following reason, because investment is critical to increase growth, sustaining growth. And between 2004 and 14, the investment rate was between 31% and 38%. Under this government, it has never exceeded 31%, which is the reason why its growth rate in the last 10 years has been consistently lower on average than for the previous Dr. Manmohan Singh government, when the growth rate was 7.8% per annum, and in the last 10 years it has been 5.8% per annum. And this has something to do with the fact that while public investment is not much higher than earlier, the private investment has not picked up. And that remains a problem till date. And this is the opposite of the situation prevailing for preceding 10 years, when the previous government, when it invested in public infrastructure, it crowded in private investment. So I was in the planning commission. I'll give you some numbers for that, for the 11th five-year plan period, for example, 2007 to 12. We allocated for that 5-year plan period about $500 billion, which is $100 billion each year, for capex, private and public taken together. It was to be shared at the rate of 50% for public and private. However, because private investment crowded in, the ultimate share was of private was 62%, and the government share came down to 38%. And yet we managed to achieve that $500 billion target and achieve $475 billion. Now, this is the difference between the previous government and public infrastructure investment. And it's a big difference because if private investment doesn't pick up, and it is still not picking up, and unfortunately this budget does rather little for raising public investment again, then the economy cannot expect to grow at the over 7% that the country needs to become Viksit Bharat. In fact, let me just say for the one last thing before I end on this, because there are many other things we have to discuss about the budget, and that is that in order to become Viksit Bharat, one would have expected by now a roadmap, and we still don't have a roadmap from this government. How we are going to get there? Independent economists, including myself, estimate that the country needs, on average, for the next 2.5 decades until 2047, at least on average 8% per annum growth. We are nowhere close to it. We've achieved in 30 years preceding this time today only 6.5, and even the OECD, World Bank, and the IMF for the rest of the 2020s until 2030 project that uh, India will not achieve anything more than 6.5% per annum. Now, that's simply not good enough to create the number of jobs that we need. And this is what is recognized by private analysts as well as Citigroup, you saw recently, HSBC, Morgan Stanley, all these people are endorsing this point of view. So let me stop there.
Right. We'll come to the jobs because that's become such an important aspect, especially in recent years. Professor Mehrotra, I want your comments on something that the finance minister said about the Indian economy in the global context. In her speech, she said, and I'm quoting here, the global economy, while performing better than expected, is still in the grip of policy uncertainties. And she goes on to say that in this context, India's economic growth continues to be the shining exception and will remain so in the years ahead. India's inflation continues to be low, stable, and moving towards the 4% target. Do you agree with the assessment, Professor Mehrotra, that India's economy has is sort of a uh, shining exception, as the finance minister called it, when you look at it in the context of the global economy?
I know the intent of your question. Um, Let me explain. You see, we have become the fastest growing large economy in the world in the last 2 years. However, what the finance minister does not state, and most government spokespersons don't recognize, is that we have, for the last 20 years, already been the second fastest growing large economy in the world for 20 years. And what has happened in the last 2 years is new to this government, but not so new for all of us who look at our performance in comparison. You see, China was growing faster. We were the second fastest, and for a variety of reasons, China's growth rate has fallen, and that's why in the last 2 years we have pipped China as the fastest growing. However, and this is absolutely central to something that I believe the FM doesn't appreciate or articulate, it is this: we are a much poorer country. We are a low middle income country. China is already an upper middle income country. China is already knocking at the doors of reaching a high income country status. We are barely at $2,800 per capita market exchange rates when the upper middle income threshold is 4,400. We are very far away from the upper middle income threshold. So we have no choice but to grow fast. No choice. And we've grown at 6.5%, 6.5% in the last 30, and that's creditable, but it's still not good enough. Therefore, this drop to 5.8% under the Modi government is actually something that should worry all of us. Which is why I'm saying that in the next 2.5 decades, to become a high income country, we have no choice but to grow at least 8% per annum. Otherwise, there's not a chance that we are becoming a Vikasita country. Second, as far as inflation is concerned, it's true that it is trending down. Having said that, one should also recognize that inflation rates have risen in the last 3 years. This government was very lucky for the first 7 years of its term on account of the international oil prices actually dropping very sharply in late 2014 from the very high levels that were sustained under the UPA government, which actually caused UPA's inflation rate, to be quite high and higher certainly than this government. However, the Drop in the oil prices led to a windfall gain for the fisc of the Modi government in the first 7 years, which it used with great bounty to spread largesse to the ordinary people of India, to run a huge welfare program. And it also ran a fiscal deficit, which is now it is having to pay for. In other words, it's gone in the last 3 or 4 years into fiscal contraction, consolidation mode at a time that, for instance, COVID happened. We relied largely upon monetary policy and fiscal stimulus, monetary policy and credit stimulus rather than a fiscal stimulus, which is the reason why in the first year of COVID, 2021, our economy contracted. China did not contract. Anyway, we've recovered since then. That certainly is true. So the point is not so much that the glass is half full, half empty. I'm going back to the FM statement, but the point really is that she's missing the big picture. That we might have become the fastest growing large economy. We might have become the fifth largest economy in the world, but that's only because UK has done very poorly and has dropped from sixth to fifth to sorry fifth to sixth. I mean, I'm now in the UK, and oh my God, inflation is high, growth rate is low. 52% of UK's children live in homes where live in poverty and live in homes where they miss one meal. So, and this is a rich country. So we are doing better than them. Well, big deal, honestly. So that's what I would say about the FM state.
Right. Another takeaway, sort of, from this budget has been the two states that have got mention and detail by the finance minister in the budget, that is Andhra Pradesh and Bihar. Now, why these states are critical, who rules these states, I think it's pretty obvious right now that they are critical NDA allies, which is why you see the finance minister talking about Andhra Pradesh, thousands of crores for the development of the capital Amravati, and in Bihar, they get airports, expressways, hospitals, colleges, and even flood mitigation, money for flood mitigation. Now, the charge that's being put is that this is a two-state budget. Where are the other states? What is the money they are getting? How do you see this, Professor Mehrotra? And is this charge that the center? A lot of opposition rule states say that the center doesn't give us money. The center doesn't give us our GST dues. How do we run the state? How do we incur our expenses? Your comments on that, Professor Mehrotra?
Yeah. So I could give you the background for that and why the opposition states are saying this, because let's not forget that it is true that many states have been denied their legitimate share in the last few years. And one of the reasons for that is that the union government has actually increased its own revenues by raking in the surpluses of the RBI first, and secondly, pulling in um, imposing cesses which go only to the union budget uh, and the union consolidated fund of India, but it doesn't need to be shared according to rules of the Finance Commission. So, so there are legitimate reasons that the states are complaining, especially uh, they are complaining because they are still in recovery mode, a lot of them. Having said that, no one can deny that Bihar is our poorest state. Andhra is uh, urgently needing a new capital, which it lost to Telangana because it lost Hyderabad. And uh, maybe my sense, my sense, Shubham, is that I believe that the central government has actually overplayed its card by giving them more than was necessary. That they would have gotten more, we knew, given that the demand was made by Mr. Naidu for 1 lakh crores. Now it never became clear that whether that was 1 lakh crores for a 5-year period or for the first year alone. But they've already been now, both of them have already been given very substantial allocations. So my response on your question is that the opposition is legitimate in this in complaining about this, because don't forget, and I repeat, that they are still recovering from COVID, and the problem is that suffered they had to bear the cost of looking after their citizens during COVID and the recovery from COVID, because most of that burden actually fell on them. And this happened at a time when GST was causing pain in the following sense. You see, I was just reading a paper by Arvind Subramaniam, who's been examining GST performance in the last 7 years. He's done a fantastic analysis which shows the following: that, to all of us, it seems, if you look at just the absolute current value numbers of GST take-ins by the government, that they have been rising. That's rising along with, partly inflation. It's rising also because the economy has recovered. However, as a proportion of GDP, all the 17 taxes that have been subsumed under GST accounted for a certain share of GDP, which it still accounts for, which means that these indirect taxes, the 17 of them, goods and services taxes of the states and center taken together, are not showing a great deal of buoyancy, so that if their contribution to revenues as a proportion of GDP is still the same as it was when GST started 7 years ago, then all the hype and the hopes around the revenue neutral GST, that it will actually lead to, after the few years, 5 years or so, an increase in revenue, has not materialized. Under the circumstances, if the government, who ought to know this background and detailed analysis, is simply riding on the rising nominal value of the GST takings in the last several years, and therefore spreading largest to Andhra and Bihar, the other states are going to feel that they are not receiving their due. And because, please remember, I began by saying that public expenditure as a proportion of GDP has been consistently shrinking slowly, because this government has been on fiscal consolidation mode. So you understand their pain. Yeah.
So effectively, you're saying two things. One, many states haven't recovered from the COVID shock, and that's one of the reasons where they're coming from, saying that they haven't gotten their due. The second one, Bihar, Andhra, so you're saying that they've gotten more than what was needed. Effectively, that's what you're saying.
I am that they've gotten more than they would have been honestly satisfied with, and there would not have been then angst as a result from the remaining opposition states. This angst, in my analysis, is justified now, and they certainly feel that it is justified, and that's why, if I remember correctly, that Niti Aayog chief ministers and union ministers meeting chaired by the prime minister, which is probably happening today or supposedly, most of the non BJP ruled states are not, chief ministers are not attending. That's a major thing. Please remember, this is the overall decision making body for the Niti Aayog. Something similar used to exist for the Planning Commission, which used to be called the National Development Council. However, this body is being rendered sort of semi-useful by the withdrawal of the non-BJP government chief ministers. As it is, NITI is not a very effective organization. It's not half as effective as the or important in the government system as the planning commission used to be.
Right. Let's then, Professor Mehrotra, come to jobs. In her speech, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said that we particularly focus on employment, skilling, MSMEs, and the middle class. She said, I'm happy to announce the Prime Minister's package of 5 schemes and initiatives to facilitate employment, skilling, and other opportunities for 4.1 crore youth. And there's over a 5 year period with a central outlay of 2 lakh crore rupees. Now, the fact that unemployment has been one of the major issues in this country, and especially how it's been handled or not tackled adequately by this government, is something that people across the board agree on. That unemployment is as an issue uh, the Modi government has not been able to tackle with. One scheme that everyone talked about, and even the finance minister spoke of it, was the internship scheme, which was basically internships for people in the top 500 companies. They'll be given a monthly allowance. Uh, how has the Modi government, in your opinion, fared on unemployment? How severe is the problem, and how inadequately have they tackled it? And B, what do you make of the announcements, a 2.1 lakh crore central outlay for tackling employment and
Let me deal with your first question. Let me deal with your first question first. So, this government over the last 10 years um, has failed to recognize the loss in jobs, the high rates of open unemployment that have happened under its watch. It doesn't even recognize or acknowledge the problem. That's why there is a constant stream of misinformation and disinformation being put out by government economists, influenced by whom the PM speaks about that same misinformation in Parliament and to the nation, even from the ramparts of the Red Fort. And this is tragic for youth. Let me elaborate before I turn to your schemes question. You see, you are spot on when you say that unemployment has become a burning issue, and I use that term burning with advisorily. You see, I've looked at the NCRB data for youth suicide, unemployed youth suicide. In 2018, just before the 2019 Lok Sabha elections, youth suicide rates used to be 3 killing themselves every 2 hours. By 2022, CRB says that number has increased to 2 killing themselves every 1 hour. That's a 33% increase. Similarly, the CSDS survey in April this year showed that compared to 2019, similar questions, similar survey, uh, in India, people who were asked the question, do you find it more difficult to find employment today? 62% said yes. Earlier in 18, early 19, sorry, they were saying 37% said yes. That all this tells you how deeply the problem is being experienced, and why it is being experienced. And yet, in 10 years, I've not heard the word employment from very much in the budget. It was slightly mentioned 1 or 2 budgets ago when the PLI was mentioned, but PLI hardly creates any jobs. The subject I'll come back to in a minute. There are 3 groups who need jobs, non-farm jobs in this country, and I'm advisedly actually using the term non-farm job because unfortunately in this government there is a belief, and that seems to have been put out also by the RBI CLEMS data recently touted uh, again by the government economist, and RBI and the PM, as showing that we created 8 crore jobs in the last 4 years, which is a rubbish claim. Let me explain that statement. Of the 8 crore so-called jobs that have been created in the last 4 years, 6 crores are farm jobs. No one wants to be in agriculture. They have been forced to be in agriculture. And thanks to this government's policy shocks delivered by its own policies, there's been an increase in the number of workers in agriculture between 2019 and 2023 of 60 million. The share of agriculture in total employment has gone up from 42% to 46%, and it's just gone down to 45.5% in this last fiscal year. Now, this happened, and yet the government doesn't talk about it. The way it talks about it, oh, we've created 6 crore new jobs. These are farm jobs. Huh? Do you want to be, Shubham, in farming? Do I want to be in farming? The young people who are getting educated, the children of farmers in villages, they all want to leave the farm and come out. And even those who reverse migrated, and the scale of reverse migration has been huge. In addition, women who had left the farm workforce prior to 2020 have rejoined it. And so the claim RBI claims data is making that look, female labor force participation has increased. Now, the point is, if they've rejoined as unpaid family labor, the woman working on the family farm is unpaid, and the government regards unpaid work as work. The rest of the world does not. ILO does not. And this is a problem with PLFS data, which RBI claims uses and government uses. It's not that I don't use it. I just make this distinction that ILO does not regard unpaid family labor as employment. And if we are serious about India becoming Vikasita Bharat, the last thing you want to do is that in a country where already 42% of the workforce produces in agriculture, which produces 15% of India's GDP, you want to reduce the numbers going and take it down to some 30%, not take it up to 45%, which is what this government has succeeded in doing. So and at the same time, manufacturing as a proportion of GDP has fallen from 17% in 2015 to 13% most recently. Never had that happened. Manufacturing employment overall has dropped, while agricultural employment has increased. There is a serious unemployment rate. So now let me turn to what the budget attempts to do. What does the budget attempts to do? It sort of offers two things. Uh, it offers something for, as you said, 500 companies, which are part of the formal sector, which is the internship. I mean, I call that apprenticeship, but they have used the term internship. No issues with the term. The point is, why would these 500 companies take on these interns, even though you may be paying some part of their stipend, you meaning government, when the demand is not picking up for the products that they are producing? Consumption growth has been running at 4% when GDP, the government claims, is growing at 8%. This never happens. Consumption growth usually historically is slightly higher than GDP growth. We have the opposite here. And yet, if demand is low, that's why consumption is low, and demand and consumption are both low because jobs are few and wages have been stagnant. Under the circumstances, why would companies hire? Big question. Government doesn't have an answer to that. The second problem is that, And is the following: the schemes that they have announced relate to MSMEs. MSMEs being given guarantees. Now, MSMEs use so they have uh, given a guarantee uh, for MSMEs that borrow, but it does not cover both capital cost, I mean capital cost borrowing and working capital borrowing, and that's a real problem because a company creates jobs when it I mean MSMEs create jobs if they can expand with the certainty that if their demand drops and they are unable to repay, then the government guarantee covers them. This is the problem. So as it is, MSMEs suffered very severely post demonetization, post a badly designed GST. That's why growth rate had fallen, and the number of MSMEs fell, and that has been proven beyond a shadow of doubt by the recently released 10 days ago data of the unorganized sector enterprises survey. The government has released them late, however, it has finally done so. I mean, we've been pushing the government for a long time because they were sitting on 3 to 4 years data for 1920, 21, 22, 22, 23, and they weren't releasing it. I was a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics to the NSO, and despite our advisory group telling them to release it, they finally released it after the election results came out, and that demonstrated how these three policy shocks, Demon GST and national lockdown at Howrah's notice, impacted the MSMEs and non-organized sector extremely adversely. The number of enterprises fell, the number of workers fell. When we know that they were always increasing in normal times between 2010 and 2015-16, because that's what the earlier ASUS data showed us. And so if MSME is not generating jobs and this scheme doesn't cover their needs in the way as I described it should, then MSMEs also will not be able to generate jobs. So my sense is the government has not thought through this carefully enough, the two schemes. It needs to go back to the drawing board because it seems that neither the corporates, organized sector, nor the unorganized sector and MSMEs are likely to generate the kinds of jobs that the government is hoping from this budget. So that's my answer to your question.
So then, what's Professor Mehrotra, when you talk about creating jobs, and like you elaborated on how not enough has been done, what then is the solution going forward? Like you talked about the Viksit Bharat and all those projections that are being made, that India will be a Viksit Bharat, and we'll have jobs. We were giving 2 lakh crores for that. And what is the solution? How do you create jobs in this environment, particularly after the policy shocks that you mentioned, demonetization, GST, and the national lockdown? Then how do you recover from it?
The economy has recovered, but it has recovered without jobs growing. And that's the problem. That's a definition of a K-shaped recovery. Uh, because that you've seen that the unorganized sector has barely created some jobs between 22 and 23. How do you create them? Well, you see, the vast majority of unorganized enterprises are MSMEs, and they are located geographically clustered in 5,500 clusters across the country. Now, this country already has, since 2005, a program called the Cluster Development Program. into which the government allocates no more than 1,000 crores per annum. What the government needs to do and should have done and should have started, I've been making this case for many years with the government, is to beef up the expenditure for the cluster development program, which provides a complement of services to every cluster which has a large number of these enterprises and provides a lot of the non-farm jobs. The services would include credit, technology support, market development, and skill development. Non-skill development, this government has consistently performed extremely poorly. We know this, that we needed to skill between 2015 and 2022 by the government's own admission in its national skills policy of 2015. We should have skilled by 2022 for 400 million people. The government itself says in the speech that we've skilled about 14 million. Now, that's simply not good enough. If obviously, because the private sector has not joined in and the schemes are poorly designed. If you locate skilling centers at these clusters, that's where the jobs are. If the young get trained, you can draw in industry's expertise into the skilling process. Don't just rely upon teaching instructors of the government. And this symbiotic relationship between government and industry at the cluster level would actually be extremely beneficial for the prospects, along with the other 3 or 4 services I mentioned, for these establishments or enterprises to actually expand. Unfortunately, what has happened in the absence of such schemes is that, as the ASUS data I just mentioned 5 minutes ago shows, the number of own account worker enterprises among the unorganized has grown. Now, these are the least productive. What you need to support are those establishments which hire workers. Meaning, if you support them, then they will expand their activities and hire more people. That's not what you're seeing in the absence of the programs that I'm talking about. Let me come back to the organized sector. How do we do it? You have said in this scheme, the organized sector will hire some 4,000 per enterprise. Why? You have to worry about the demand side and the consumption not growing, because without that growing, investment will not grow, and without investment, jobs will not grow, and they will not need that many interns or apprentices. So, exhorting them by saying to them, do this in the national interest. That's what the FM keeps saying to them. It's in the national interest. Well, if I am a profit-making capitalist, I don't invest in the national interest. I invest only when I'm likely to make profit, and I'm likely to make profit on a sustained basis if demand is growing. The trouble is that the organized sector is actually making good profits hand over fist by not expanding output, and still the prices have tended to be high. Inflation has been high. Why? It's not because of wages that inflation is relatively high. It's because profits are actually quite robust, and that's the issue. Because when the organized sector, 500 top firms, their profits keep growing at a time when wages are stagnant. They use the money how? The first thing they did was to amortize all their debt. They repaid the banks. So they deleveraged, and they are much less indebted now than they were 3-4 years ago. That's one thing they did. with their rising high profit. The second thing that they did was that that they actually felt that we don't really need to invest. We are making good profit. So they didn't invest. So that's why private investment is not climbing, even though public investment is climbing. And that's where the crunch is. So what do I mean? That it goes back to the you know government actually recognizing we have a demand issue, we have a consumption issue. The growth pattern has to change. The third thing that needs to happen is that, well, and to some extent, this government in this budget has done this, an employment linked incentive as opposed to production linked incentive. So they have come up with that. It's too little too late because what is being happening, because these organized sector industry activities tend to be relatively capital intensive. They don't generate that much. If you have a growing share of labor intensive manufacturing, they will generate jobs. That was the way China did it. What are the five main labor intensive manufacturing sectors which have seen job losses in the last 5 or 6 years? I mean, I can prove that using PLFS data: food processing, textiles, garments, uh, furniture, and leather and footwear. Now, these have only barely recovered, and they actually suffered declines in absolute employment, and which is the reason I was saying to you, manufacturing employment has fallen in absolute terms. And so, in other words, what we need to make sure is to find out what are the special packages we need in order that these five sectors begin to grow again. And please remember that these five sectors are also have a lot of unorganized enterprise. That's why it connects to the earlier point I was making. And finally, I mean, I'm not listing all of my suggestions here because that will require another discussion between us. Finally, the government has to stop worrying about the rupee falling compared to the dollar. Because that means if the RBI keeps intervening and buying up dollars constantly, the rupee doesn't fall. Now, if the rupee depreciates, because see, don't forget our inflation rate has been relatively high compared to our competitors, and our exchange rate, real and effective exchange rate, is impacted by that. And this government has allowed the real effective exchange rate to appreciate and not depreciate. Now, UPA government kept the real effective exchange rate stable. This government has allowed it to appreciate. As a result, our exports are not doing so well as they could or should. Services exports are doing fine, but services exports, especially the IT ones, they don't generate that many jobs. The jobs they generate are all for very highly skilled people. On the other hand, merchandise goods exports have recovered, but not to the extent that we need it to. So if so, the what are the two sources of demand? One is domestic, the other is external. And I've given you a very important causative factor that has prevented exports from continuing to grow.
Right. Professor Mehrotra, two more questions I'd like to quickly just get your thoughts on. The first is Manrega. This is an article that is published in the Hindu, and we'll have that play on the screen for our viewers. It says that allocation for Manrega is lower than last year's actual expenditure. Now, in terms of numbers for the financial year 2024-2025, 86,000 crore rupees has been allotted for Manrega. Now, while this is 26,000 crore more than last year's allocation, it is still 19,297 crores less than the scheme's actual expenditure of 1.05 lakh crore in the last financial year. Professor Mehrotra,
Let me
how
answer that
critical
question,
is
then you ask the second. I've understood. Is this good enough? Uh, it's a short answer. See, the point is that this is a demand-based scheme, and as in last few years, demand for Manrega has remained high because non-farm jobs have not grown, and also because 60 million workers were added to agriculture. So, because it's demand-based, they'll be forced to increase the allocation as they've done in the last. So, I'm less worried about that. However, let me add another if the point that if the government wants to avoid continuing to spend more on Manrega, which is a rural program, they should think about starting an urban housing program for the vast majority of uh, small and middle towns in our country. If it did that with fiscal resources, then it'll pull workers out of agriculture. When that happens, Manrega expenditure will drop, and an urban employment guarantee would be substitutive of the rural employment. So I would do that and not continue to increase as we've done in the last 2 years expenditures on rural Manrega. Yeah, please go ahead with the next question.
Professor Mehrotra, final question. What's there in this budget for the middle class? One thing that, while you talked about the nitty-gritties, the fine prints of the economy, jobs, inflation, one thing that a lot of people continue to ask is, इसमें हमारे लिए क्या है? What is there for us now? There are new tax regime that has been tweaked slightly in terms of tax slabs for the middle class. The Prime Minister said that this budget is for the empowerment of the new middle class. What is there for the middle class, Professor Mehrotra? Is it empowerment in the true sense in this budget? That's my final question to you.
Shubham, the term empowerment is rather difficult to define. I don't know how the Prime Minister defines it, and honestly, in the context of a budget, I don't know how to define it myself. And if if someone says that, oh, the job schemes, the MSME schemes are for the middle class, maybe they are. We'll see. But I mean, I've questioned that. So, my friend, we'll have to wait to see. I don't think I think the government got away without doing too much for the middle class this time. Essentially, that's the sense I come away with.
Right. Professor Santosh Mehrotra, thank you so much for taking out the time and speaking with me. It's been a very thorough, incisive conversation on the economy, especially for someone like me who doesn't quite understand the details of the economy and the way you've put it. I'm sure it'll be pretty insightful for so many who watch this conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Mehrotra, for taking out the time. And to our viewers, thank you so much for tuning into this conversation. And do subscribe to HW News English for more such interviews and in-depth conversations.
Stay ahead with our cutting-edge news app. Instantly access the latest shorts in just 1 minute and breaking news in just 50 words. Download now for a smarter, faster news experience.